Welcome to the next edition of Khanversations, everyone. Today I'm talking to Dr. Dan Bottomley, who is the Associate Director at the Institute of Global Studies. He is in charge of global partnerships and relationships and affiliations and programs. He's also an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Delaware. Dan and I go long back, as long ago as 10 years. We were working on a State Department grant in Egypt, trying to promote a dialogue between American and Middle Eastern scholars. And now we continue to work on State Department grants that deal with national security and American foreign policy. Now, this particular conversation is part of the Center for Global and Area Studies lecture series called ARSC 300. The topic for this year is religion and politics in secular democracies. And Dr. Bottomley will be talking about the role of religion in America's grant strategy. So we will start off by trying to understand what grant strategy itself is. So Dan, tell us, what is grant strategy?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I hope everyone out there is being healthy and social distancing, as we all are at the moment. So grant strategy is one of these topics that gets thrown about quite a bit, but is not always clearly defined on what exactly it is and how it's deployed. When I look at grant strategy, I start with the word, and that really kind of gets to what I conceptualize as grant strategy. It's all about choices, and it's about decision-making. So if you're practicing strategic planning or strategic thinking, even for the students in business or any of the other programs, you're really deciding what choices you want to make and what choices you want to ignore. Right? If you're being strategic with anything, you're going forward in one direction and avoiding other things for a variety of reasons. So grant strategy, in theory at least, really informs and provides guidance on what are the state's goals and priorities and what choices you're going to make to get to those goals. There's a really great definition I like from Hal Brands. He's a grant strategy theorist, I believe at Johns Hopkins now. But his quote says that grant strategy is the intellectual framework that connects means to ends, ideas to action, at the highest level of national affairs. It is a country's guiding conception of where it wants to go and how it wants to get there. I think that, to start off this conversation, really gets at what we're talking about when we consider grant strategy.
So, I mean, the last part is, I think, the critical part of articulating. Where does a nation want to go and how does it get there? I mean, this is clearly, if this the most succinct conception that we can potentially have of grant strategy. So where is the US trying to get to at the moment, Dan? Where are we going?
If I knew, I'd be working at a big law firm somewhere, a big corporation, right? What we've really seen in grant strategy since the end of the Cold War is it's jumped around quite a bit, right? Is during the Cold War, we kind of had a general conception of grant strategy being really focused on containment, right? Is the US is a union, and we need to contain that threat as much as possible and in order to achieve victory, right? Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen some semblances of grant strategy. Some people point to the war on terror as an example of a grant strategy in action. But what we've really seen in the United States, even back to the Obama administration and through to today, is a lot of thinking about jumping from crisis to crisis, right? As something comes up, it emerges, it becomes a huge issue, and then it goes away into the background a little bit, and then we jump to the next thing. And what we're seeing right now, obviously, and I think what we're going to see in the future is a lot more thinking about grant strategy, especially considering the current circumstances we're in with much of the world under quarantine due to COVID-19.
See, one of the challenges of grant strategy is maybe administrations articulate a grant strategy and then they forget about it. Their policies are usually trying to douse fires all over the place, or they're trying to deal with some major singular problem. For example, the Obama administration was trying to push through the JCPOA with Iran in the
Mhm.
last 2 years of his term. It was more about maybe Obama's foreign policy legacy rather than a grand strategy, right? It was probably part of Obama's grand strategy, but not definitely part of the US grand strategy. So even though academics like to talk to it, do you think that practitioners also pay equal attention to what grand strategy is really all about?
Not as much as I would hope. Um, One of the big things that we see in the United States and why it's somewhat difficult to make a cogent grand strategy that lasts for a long time are two reasons. One are term limits, right? Is a president can only be a president for 8 years. In that time, you can develop a strategy, but President Obama has this great quote about the presidency being a big relay race. You're just handing the baton over to the next person to take over, and you can have a president who comes in and decides that the previous strategy that we had is completely wrong, and we're going to dismantle the whole thing. You saw this quite a bit when President Trump came in, is a lot of the agreements that Obama created were done away with, climate accords, JCPOA, some of the other ones. So that's one of the big issues we see. Another one is looking at the difference between the strategists who may be sitting a little higher up in the administration and the people on the ground actually implementing policy. I don't think that we've seen, even when we have national security strategies that come out from each administration, we're not seeing a lot of the desk officers at the embassies pulling that out every day and referencing it to do their job. They may pull out some of the quotes and put it in there for the speeches for the ambassadors and things
Yeah.
like that, but you're seeing a bit of a disconnect between policy formulation and policy implementation that really is a hindrance to making grand strategy kind of go forward.
I was recently talking to a colleague of mine saying that, I'm interested in doing some work in this area of grand strategy. I want to write about it. I just published a short piece about maybe the US needs to rethink its grand strategy after the coronavirus. Maybe the world is changing so significantly that we need to rethink where we are going and how we want to get there. But he made an interesting observation. He said, why? America's grand strategy has always been the same. And I said, what is that? And it is to remain a preeminent, dominant power worldwide. So if you say that we want to be the number one, we want to be the number one power and the dominant power. And so everything else is about how to retain and defend that position. So then probably there is no need to ever consider thinking about grand strategy, and there's no worry that this continuity would be lost. Every president will continue to achieve America's, or rather retain or keep America great as it always was, right?
Well, one, I don't know if the U.S. has always been in a position of preserving hegemony, right? You had to get
Yeah,
there first, right?
yeah.
This is really more of like a mid-20th century phenomenon through to today. And a lot of that was, again, go back to the idea of containment. It's U.S. is caught in this bipolar, soft war, sometimes Cold War, sometimes hot in different areas to oppose the Soviet Union. And then, in the early 90s, we became the hegemon. And since then, you're really kind of figuring out how to go forward from there. And I mean, that may be the ultimate goal, is to preserve as much power as possible. But first off, I don't know how you can actually define that. But second of all, how do you get to that point, right? What policies, what objectives can you do to get to that point? How can you create influence in a world that's rapidly changing? Right, the Clinton administration had an idea of spreading democracy and bringing more Eastern European countries into Europe.
Mhm.
That some would argue that backfired because it upset Russia, and now we've seen just Russia take over large portions of the Ukraine and Georgia and other areas. Another point that people point to is that a lot for the Clinton administration, George H.W. Bush is bringing China into the fold a little bit, bringing to the World Trade Organization and some of these other international bodies to make them part of the system, right? With the idea that we can all benefit. That's backfired in some
Some ways too, yeah.
argue, because now you've seen a rise of anti-China sentiment and the growth of populism, because a lot ordered out of the United States. So that's one of the things that we always have to consider, right? Is if that's, first off, if you're going to have a strategy, you need to have some sort of objective, something you want to do. If that's preserving the power that you have, fine, but how do you define those things, and what are the specific policies that can go forward to help you achieve those goals?
Well, coming back to our topic is the role of religion in America's grand strategy. So where does religion fit into America's vision of where it wants to go, what kind of a nation it wants to become, and what are the religious, if any, goals of America's grand strategy?
Sure. I always look at religion as its influences, and it informs the conception of and choices in grand strategy, right? It informs, it's a knowledge base that people use to kind of conceptualize the United States and where it is and how it can continue. I'll give a couple of examples. I keep talking about containment, since that's a good one, right? Because it shows a lot of grand strategy. There are a lot of religious undertones in our policies during the Cold War, right? The communists were atheists.
Yeah.
They were the antithesis of what we consider a true power and what the world should be. So therefore, we have to mitigate that atheism in order to preserve and protect our freedoms, freedom of religion, expression, etc. So there was a lot of religious undertones during the Cold War, both domestically, when we're talking about within the United States and those conversations, and in our foreign policy. Another big one is, again, more recently, as I mentioned before, the war on terror for under the George W. Bush administration, right? Is that we're on a crusade to protect the United States. We're on a crusade against those who try to undermine our values. And, and in some circles, there's the idea of American exceptionalism taken to an extreme level, is that it argues that Americans are the chosen people and that they are here to protect the freedoms of the world, right? So what I always look at when we're talking about religion and how it relates to grand strategy is it really informs those who are thinking about it, conceptualizing grand strategy, and it also is kind of like a fallback perspective, that when there's a crisis emerge, you tend to go back to your kind of base assumptions. And I think religion comes into play quite a bit there.
As I look at the history of American foreign policy and the history of America expanding as a nation, I think perhaps the first coherent and clear-cut articulation of a grand strategy or a doctrine that shaped US grand strategy was the idea of manifest destiny. So if we think of manifest destiny as the first major grand strategic vision that the US pursued, that was clearly informed by religion and religious values, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's one of the ones I wanted to talk about as well, is this idea that it is our destiny to control the entire continent is a big one. But even go back a little bit farther, if we want to go back to kind of the Western settlement of the United States, is the Pilgrims. Pilgrims are coming to the United States for religious freedom. That's one of the big reasons why they sailed here. So you have a lot of these colonies founded upon these religious undertones of preserving and protecting a religion. And then it kind of escalates and snowballs into something like you're talking about, manifest destiny. That we have to protect the souls of those who do not subscribe to our religion by expanding out and controlling more land.
So it's not just that religion shapes our grand strategy, but it is also that because religion played such an important part in America becoming America, that it continues to somehow underpin our foreign policy objectives and our grand strategy. So I want to move fast forward and then come back to 1992. I mean, the Soviet Union has collapsed and we are looking for a new threat. So would you consider Sam Huntington's article, The Clash of Civilizations, as essentially an articulation of a new grand strategy, completely, shall we say, packaged in the language and geopolitics of religion?
That's a big question. Um, I think in part, I mean, when you're talking about these civilizational arguments,
Yeah.
a big part of again, I go back to this idea of like, how are you defining civilization? And I think for Huntington's piece and what we've seen, from then on is a lot of the definitions of what civilizations are use religious underpinnings, right? There's undertones for how you describe uh, different cultures, civilizations, whatever you want to name them, right? And I think that plays out there. And again, it goes back to the idea that, when you're having some sort of trauma, however you want to describe that, a lot of times you fall back to your standard operating procedures. If there's a crisis, a critical event, you're going to go back to kind of what your base knowledge is. And I think what we see in a lot of these issues when we're jumping from crisis to crisis is a lot of falling back to that, falling back to the religious underpinning of our strategies and how we define certain things.
Uh, we are going through a very strange phase historically. Some of the traditional, or at least the more recent values of the United States, that we are not just a democracy, but also an advocate for democracy. We are also an advocate for human rights and openness, and we were also an advocate for an interconnected world, globalization, etc. So these were some of the values that sort of pushed us to establish, defend, promote, even to a great extent, shall we say, we kind of subsidize the global liberal international order, right? And so creating and maintaining, on hindsight, creating and maintaining the international liberal order, we could argue, might have been one of the United States' grand strategic goals. But now we see that the United States is probably dismantling what it did. So are we at a moment where there is a significant departure from America's past grand strategy, or what's going on?
It's definitely a reaction. Um, what we have seen, the United States was a key player and instrumental in creating the liberal order, right? Liberal international order. And you've seen a lot of pushback on that, especially from in more recent times. You've seen the growth of populism around the world, saying that maybe this liberal international order isn't the greatest thing. But I mean, as far as President Trump is concerned, he's been very, very consistent. A lot of his comments and things that he's talking about now, vis-a-vis international organizations, NATO, et cetera, were first articulated in the 1980s. So it's not that different. It's been a long-standing narrative. It's just what's interesting for the Trump administration is, again, is you have one person who's articulating a certain vision that may be antithetical to what's been built for the last 20, 30 years, but those who are actually the ones implementing said policy on the ground, the people in the embassies, people in the military, et cetera, still maintain a commitment to that liberal order. So we're seeing a bit of a tension here, a disconnect between the vision of a president and the vision of grand strategies should be from the chief executive policymakers and the ones who are actually implementing things on the ground.
So you're suggesting to me that President Trump might actually have a grand strategy?
I do, ish. I think he's been very, very consistent in his thoughts on different international organizations. I mean, the whole idea of America first, right? You could consider that in a sense a grand strategy. It's that we have been, he uses the phrase, again, back from the 80s on now, he's using the phrase, they're eating our lunch to describe, NATO members who aren't paying their dues every year. Mm-hmm. NAFTA was one of the worst agreements we've ever signed. It's taking away American jobs. I mean, it's a very, very nationalistic vision for what a grand strategy should be. It's very much zero sum and go it alone and not worry so much about allies, which again is much different from what we've seen from World War II on.
See, one of the things that about America First that I find it difficult to comprehend. It is trying to say as if America so far had acted in a way to suggest America Second or America something else. Let me give you an example. As we face the coronavirus pandemic, one of the things that the US federal government is doing is just printing money. We have basically thrown trillions of dollars of liquidity into the market. And now the stimulus package was $2 trillion and another package is being added to it. So we are just printing money and releasing it. And because of the fact that America has been a dominant player in the global economy and the world, the value of dollar is still significant. And we are able to do this without, I mean, there's a point beyond which the value of dollar will begin to diminish rapidly. And then we would have huge problems. But it is this preeminent position in global politics that allows the US to do certain things to address domestic economic problems, which other countries probably cannot do. If India started printing rupees to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, it's going to suffer maybe double or even triple-digit inflation, and it'll have lots of international problems. And all of these things are because of the previous grand strategy, right? So we are in this position today. So why is it that this desire to assert America first, as if America was never first?
I think a lot of it is the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself will point to certain areas in the United States who have not benefited from the liberal international order, right? It is, you go to certain areas of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Illinois, where I'm from, and you see a bunch of empty factories because a lot of those jobs were sent away and there wasn't a strong, cogent policy for how to retrain the people who worked there. So they were kind of left, in the lurch, so to speak. So while at the macro level, the United States has benefited tremendously from this because of these things. We are able to implement some of these stimulus packages that we're able to implement now because we have that kind of backing and support, and we're able to. It's a very, very strong country. But when you peel back a level and go drill down a little bit more into particular pockets of people, you're going to see a lot of those folks feel like they've been left behind, and those jobs have not been replaced. And there's large scale unemployment in a lot of rural areas that I think the Trump administration and Trump himself as a politician really tapped into to go forward.
As we look forward, and we are seeing some challenges, we see that the United States is having trouble in sustaining its alliances, which have traditionally kept it strong, say with Europe, and then we see that one of the regions which is so critical to the US, the Middle East, is in quite a turmoil, and China continues to rise in wealth, in influence, and power. And now China is contesting and challenging the United States, where I think is the core advantage that we always had, which was in technology. So with this whole 5G thing, etc., we see that China may have caught up in certain aspects of science and technology, or may already be ahead of us, especially on issues of environmental, green technology and robotics, etc. So is it possible now for the United States to continue to think of itself as clearly a dominant power and preserve this? Do we really need to rethink our grand strategy now, given the altered circumstances of relative power vis-a-vis our global challenger?
I think it would benefit a lot of grand strategists within government, the ones who are coming up with these things, to really consider it not so much as poles, but as an entire system, right? The United States is a very, very important player, but we're seeing that one of the big issues with grand strategy is, as a lot of people note, some of the critics, is that it's too focused on narrow things, right? It's basically trying to shove everything that's completely out there under one umbrella and say, this is our grand strategy, let's funnel it in there. But I think if we see a reorientation on that, of considering it not so much as one strategy, but it's very, very complex phenomenons that are out there, but they're all part of a one big system. And how can we consider grand strategy in light of a systemic world where things are so interconnected that you may not be in a position to maintain your hegemony indefinitely, but if you consider your strengths and look at it as part of a larger worldwide system, and I think the COVID-19 crisis is really showing this right now, right? Is that viruses don't respect national boundaries, right? They'll go wherever they want. You really need to consider it as part of a systemic, at the systemic level, and try to develop a lot of your strategies and policies from that perspective.
Last week, or maybe I think 10, 12 days ago, Stephen Walt published a piece in Foreign Policy, which was very troubling. He argued that one of the reasons or sources of US soft power, or its perception as an important player, was its perception as a competent nation. And now COVID-19 is making us look as extremely incompetent as a country. We are unable to deal with it politically as well as technologically. I want to take a step back and ask you a purely academic question. Who are the main grand strategy thinkers at the moment in the US? I don't mean historically, but at the moment. I mean, yes, we're familiar with Henry Kissinger and John Kennan, and all of these people were big names in the past. But who are the main grand strategy thinkers today in the US?
Well, one of the ones that I really like is John Gaddis. He wrote this amazing book called, coincidentally enough, on grand strategy. He does, takes a historical look at grand strategy. It's oriented towards the Greeks and kind of that Western tradition, but he does a great job of kind of explaining how it works and how it works in the field, and what are these certain pivot points that when you're conceptualizing a grand strategy to be aware of, and that you can kind of maximize some of your leverage there to achieve those goals that you want. Another one, as I mentioned earlier, is Hal Brands. He's a very, very good grand strategist. I don't always agree with what he says, but I think it's well respected. Beverly Gage, who's also at Yale, she's another one who does a lot of important kind of grand strategic thinking. I think can help quite a bit as we navigate these terrains.
And of course, Charles Hill, that we meet every summer. Yes. And,
yeah.
Yeah. Also, a recent book by Barry Posen on what foreign policy of restraint, I think, which is also a kind of a grand strategy coming much more from the libertarian tradition, perhaps. So my final question to you, that how do you see the next 20, 30 years from a grand strategic perspective? Is there going to be a new purpose to American foreign policy? Is there a new purpose that the United States may seek now that we have turned our back to the international liberal order? Or if there is a change in government in November, we will see us going back to pre-Donald Trump grand strategy and back to restoring the same old alliances and the same old liberal order?
I think, I hate to use the cliche because it's become such a cliche, but we live in internet, right? I do think the COVID-19 situation is really will be a big changer for what we consider grand strategy. I think it's going to kind of put away that idea that pandemics are beneath us, right? Not just the United States, but for everybody, right? It's something that a lot of folks have been warning about for years, but was always kind of put on the back burner, right? It's something that has been defunded by quite a few governments, not just the United States. So I think what you're really going to see in the next 20, 30 years is, like I said, is thinking more systematically about these issues rather than just, United States foreign policy, one entity negotiating with another one. I think you're going to have to look at it as much more of a complexity. And what you're going to see are a lot of policies that are interrelated, but not necessarily recognized as interrelated right now. So you're going to see a lot more blending and kind of this hybridity of, economic, military, diplomatic, forces, phenomena coming together in the US foreign policy. So it may shift back a little bit depending on how November happens, but I think one of the fundamental things you're going to see in the next 20, 30 years is really more of a, like I said, a holistic approach to foreign policy rather than just United States working with one other country.
See, if the task of identifying long-term goals and identifying long-term strategy is left to the practitioners who are in government, then it's going to be problematic because the nature of the job itself requires for them to be episodic. They have a major episode here, they're trying to deal with that. They have another problem there, they're trying to deal with that issue. So I think that the best place to do long-term thinking is indeed the academy, not even the think tanks, which are constantly trying to provide the government with the intellectual needs to deal with contemporary problems. It's probably the universities which have to. But in the last few years, especially with the rise of a tendency among some Americans to deride academics, this anti-elitism, which is also populism. So there is a kind of reduction in the stature and influence of experts, right, including foreign policy experts. So I hope that that one of the unintended or one of the consequences of coronavirus will be the restoration of the importance of scientists and experts, and as part of that, perhaps people like Gaddis and others will again begin to have greater influence on long-term foreign policy thinking. So I want to thank Professor and Dr. Dan Bottomley for this wonderful and interesting conversation on grand strategy. This is a very important topic which is not often discussed as much as it ought to be. And I think universities which do not have a course on grand strategy ought to have a course in grand strategy, at least one course for those who want to work in the foreign policy, in the State Department, in defense, or any national security related areas. So thank you very much, Professor Bottomley, for enlightening us on this subject. And I thank you and also wish you a safe and relaxed response to the coronavirus pandemic. Get your work done and be safe.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.